Welcome back, Flatline Nation. Today I'm going to work on a straight peen hammer. This is going to be a super low budget build. So I went to Harbor Freight and picked up one of their 2-pound sledges for about $6, and I want to turn it into a straight peen hammer. Pretty much everybody's familiar with a cross peen hammer, but the difference is instead of a horizontal peen, it has a vertical peen. So let's give that a try. Like I said before, this is a pretty low budget build, so I didn't even bother to buy a new hammer handle, which in hindsight probably would have been a good idea. But here I'm going to knock out the rest of the wood from the hammer eye and get it into the forge. The toughest thing for me over the course of this whole build is keeping that hammer eye nice and symmetrical and nice and straight. Obviously I'm not super worried about the heat treatment on this hammerhead because I'm going to have to redo it again anyway. So toss it into the forge and get it up to forging temperature and get it ready to start drawing out that peen. Here I'm using the drawing dies on my press to put an even radius on both sides of the peen close to the hammer eye, and then I'm drawing the material away from the hammer eye and then trying to keep it nice and square as I go. I've never done anything quite like this, so I'm fully winging it at this point, but I'm surprised at how well it actually turned out. Just working each side, drawing that material down and away, trying to keep it all nice and even, and trying to keep it flat on the top. I don't want the peen to swell away from the body of the hammerhead. The nice thing about working these big chunks of metal is they retain the heat pretty well, so it only took about 2 heats to get this forged to shape. Here we go back to the drawing dies on the press again. Using that kiss block to make sure I don't over squish the material, I'm just kind of drawing that peen away from the hammer eye. As the hammer itself loses some temperature, I use the drawing dies more as a planishing tool. Try to kind of smooth it out as much as I can before I take it to the grinder. The whole time I'm working on this project, I'm constantly checking to make sure everything is nice and square because an off-center hammerhead really is a pain to use. So I'm doing my best to keep this one nice and square. And that's really about all it took as far as the forging goes. There's a lot more time spent on the grinder getting it nice and cleaned up. Once I was done with the forging, it was time to take it to the grinder and get everything nice and looking good. It had a more of a flat face on it, and I really wanted a rounding hammer on one side and the straight peen on the other. So I took all those corners off and really created a nice round shape. And I flattened off the peen and then created a nice even radius on both sides. I used the 2-inch contact wheel on the top of my flat platen to create those chamfers on the sides of the hammer face. It's just a nice, easy, subtle slope that was easy to achieve without having to switch to my small contact wheel. Once I got it all ground to shape and got everything set the way I wanted it to, I took it to a Scotch-Brite belt and got everything looking nice and clean before I took it over for heat treat. All right, so we got a midway progress report. So that's essentially what I started with, one of those 2-pound sledge shapes. Took it down to a pretty decent looking straight peen. Now, once again, this is a Harbor Freight special, so I have no idea what alloy of Chinesium this is. So I'm just going to guess that it's somewhere in the 4140 range for heat treatment purposes. I've seen others do water quenches for hammerhead, so I figured that was probably appropriate here. I heated it up to what looked like a critical temperature and dunked it in water and agitated it quite a bit. I really can't stress this enough. I have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to this, but I don't know what it should look like coming out of the quench, but I do know that there's a pretty easy anvil test to do and see if your hammer's hard. So I'm going to lightly drop the hammer on the face of the anvil, and that ringing sound that you hear and the nice rebound that we get, that tells me it's nice and hard. I'm going to do a torch temper on this. I'm going to heat up the body of the hammerhead on either side of the eye first and allow the heat to kind of drift into both sides of the hammer face. I'm looking for a bluish color on both sides. I don't want it to be really hard, but I want it to retain some of the hard qualities of a good hammer. Once I see the temper colors I'm looking for, I'm going to pull the hammer off of that spindle and dunk it in water and try to arrest that temper, and that way it won't go too much farther beyond where I want it to go. I don't have a ton of experience doing torch tempers on hammers or blades, but I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. If I knew exactly what alloy of steel this was, I could have thrown it in the even heat to get a really nice even temper on it, but again, this is a total budget build. Time for a quick cleanup on the wire wheel, but seriously, don't use gloves while you're using the wire wheel. It's a bad idea. Now it's back to the Scotch-Brite belts, get everything nice and polished up. Here I'm using the blue, the fine grit Scotch-Brite belt. And I really like these things. They put a really nice, smooth satin finish on your projects. It's really important to have nice, clean, smooth faces on your hammers because any indentation on your hammer faces is going to repeat that indent into your work pieces and can be super annoying. So these Scotch-Brite belts go a long way in creating a nice, consistent, smooth surface. So at this point, the hammer head itself is basically done. It just needs to get a nice protective coating on it. Now we're ready to move on to handle. In keeping with the theme of super budget build, I decided to reuse the handle from the original hammer. So I'm trying to kind of make that fit in the current hammer eye. It works out pretty well. Because of the shape of the original hammer, I have to sand it down quite a bit to make it fit that shape. And I also do some recontouring and make it more comfortable to hold. Now, I'm not a physicist and I'm not a hammer maker, and I have no idea why this works, but it's super satisfying the fact that you can smack it on the bottom of the handle and it seats the head onto the hammer handle. I love it. It's time for one more trip to the slack belt on the 2x72 and get that handle nice and contoured and comfortable to hold. Here we go again with the physics hammer maker magic. I have no idea exactly why that works, but it is so satisfying. And now I'm going to use the wedge that I made out of some mystery hardwood that I had laying around and get that locked in nice and tight. I'm not going to use any kind of glue or anything. I fully expect this handle to take a lot of abuse, and I want to be able to either tighten it up or replace it relatively easily in the future. So here it is with the handle set into the hammer, and at this point it's a fully functional hammer. I just want to do a few more finishing touches to it, so I'm going to burn the handle and get rid of that lacquer finish that comes on those cheap Harbor Freight hammers. If you've used one, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm going to burn that off, raise some of the texture off of the wood, and that gives you a little bit more grip. And I'm going to put a nice coat of linseed oil on there and just kind of try to make it look nice. I'm going to put some coats of linseed oil on there just to rehydrate the wood after you burn it. And that just makes it last longer and stand up to the heat of forging better. And then I'm going to take some paste wax and I'm going to apply that both to the hammer head and the hammer handle. So a couple coats of linseed oil and a couple coats of paste wax and rub down with a nice microfiber cloth. That's really all it takes to do just your standard maintenance on hammers, and pretty much every hammer that I have gets this treatment about once a month. So this is where we started, a 2-pound Harbor Freight sledgehammer, just standard run-of-the-mill $6 sledge. And we turned it into this, a pretty cool straight peen hammer. A couple hours of work, had a fun evening, and I've used this hammer a ton since I made it. It's honestly one of my go-to hammers at this point. It needs a little longer handle, I've noticed, but that aside, I'm super happy with a $6 sledge turning into this super cool hammer. I really hope you enjoyed following along with this straight peen hammer build. If you like what you see, be sure and like and subscribe for more forging content, and follow me on Instagram at Flatline Knives.